Lesson 1. Understanding Binge Eating Disorder. The core of BED is recurrent episodes of binge eating. But how does the DSM-V define a binge? The two following traits must be present. Eating an amount of food that is significantly more than most would eat in similar circumstances in a short amount of time. Loss of control over how much, what one is eating. Feeling like one cannot stop eating. Episodes of binge eating also must include at least 3 of the following characteristics: eating rapidly, eating to the point of discomfort, eating when one is not physically hungry, eating alone so others do not know how much one is eating, episodes followed by feelings of shame, guilt, disgust, distress around the binge eating behavior. Binge eating occurs at least once a week for a period of 3 months. No compensatory behaviors are present: purging, laxative use, excessive exercise, etc. What constitutes a binge? The diagnostic criteria for BED first defines a binge as eating a large amount of food in a relatively short period. Such a vague description leaves room for much interpretation, as what is considered an abnormally large amount of food tends to vary among individuals. Some use the word binge to denote eating 2 candy bars, while a typical binge for someone with BED might look like 5,000 calories of whole pizzas and cartons of ice cream. When it comes down to it, an individual must remember that their experience must be looked at in context with other diagnostic criteria. Note also that DSM-V does not specify what food or type of food one must eat to comprise a binge. Though individuals typically opt for sugary, high-fat, or salty foods during a binge, someone with BED could potentially be reaching out for carrots. The bottom line is that regardless of what food one is eating, the time span, or even how much one is eating, the characteristics of BED do not exist separately from each other. One is not experiencing an episode representative of BED unless they meet the second requirement of the criteria, which is a sense of loss of control over eating. A binge can be compared to an external force that comes over an individual. It is like a hurricane that has swept one into the chaos, and they must act accordingly until the storm is over. When the urge to binge strikes someone with BED, the individual feels powerless over the compulsion to obtain food as quickly as possible. In a way, it feels like one is a bystander outside their own body. One can only watch themselves from afar as they fall into the same pattern, feeling entirely unable to stop the behavior. Once the episode ends, the shame and disgust set in once again. When described this way, BED sounds much like the pattern of a substance use disorder or other addiction. This comparison is quite valid. Both BED and a substance use disorder are centered on the need for an individual to receive the high they get from their respective drug. Food is a drug to those struggling with BED, and these individuals will do anything to get their fix. If one does not have food readily available, they will go to extreme lengths to obtain it. This behavior could look like venturing from drive-thrus to grocery stores to obtain an excessive amount of food at all hours of the night, spending an excessive amount of money on binge food, or even stealing food from others. One might have certain rituals about what food they start eating first, or where they go to obtain food before or during a binge. Overall, compulsion marked by obsessive thoughts that lead to a loss of control is one of the clearest markers of BED. Just like in other forms of addiction, there is an isolative component to BED. Most of the time, one will separate themselves from others to eat due to their behavior which they deem embarrassing or shameful. Individuals will also be hyper-aware of assuring others do not find out about their behavior. They might have their own stash of food so others will not recognize how much one is eating, disguise how much food has been taken from certain packages or jars, or sneakily dispose of wrappers and containers. There is heavy consideration involved, as an individual spends the majority of the day not engaging with those around them, but thinking about food, what they are going to eat, where they are going to obtain that food, and when they will be able to eat. Those enraptured by the urge to binge eat are fixated on one thing only: to obtain as much food as possible, as quickly as possible, and to consume rapidly without even tasting the food. As later chapters will discuss, BED is not really about the food. One will eat and eat until either the food is gone or one's stomach cannot take in any more due to feeling unbearably physically ill. Next comes the overwhelming feelings of guilt and shame rising to the surface. In BED, no compensatory behaviors seen in bulimia nervosa, such as purging, laxative use, or excessive exercise, are present. Still, consuming an excess of calories may spur restrictive eating behavior for the hours, days, or even weeks following a binge. One will try to desperately regain control of their behavior as to not gain weight. But limiting calories only perpetuates the binge restrict cycle, as restrictive eating behavior only sets one up to overeat later. The DSM declares that binge eating episodes at least once a week for at least 3 months characterizes BED. At the same time, distress caused by binge eating behavior should not be ignored. If one's binge eating episodes do not occur as frequently or do not seem to encompass all traits listed in the diagnoses, but is still of concern, it is valid and worth discussing with a medical professional. Distinguishing BED from other behaviors. To be able to build or maintain a healthy relationship with food, an individual must develop self-awareness in their behaviors. They must learn to distinguish between what is normal, what is a healthy indulgence, what is becoming an unhealthy habit, and what could be indicative of a more serious problem. It is crucial for one to understand, though often used interchangeably, disordered eating and an eating disorder are not the same. While disordered eating refers to abnormal eating patterns or behavior around food, an eating disorder is an all-consuming, severe mental disorder caused by a complex mix of factors. It is certainly possible for disordered eating behavior, for example, skipping meals during the day, then overeating at night, to ignite an eating disorder if one is predisposed to developing one. But one must recognize that just because an unhealthy behavior is occurring does not mean that one fits the diagnostic criteria for a full-blown eating disorder. It is also important that one not self-diagnose, but instead seek the expert opinion of a medical professional if they believe they may have an eating disorder, such as BED. Several terms are often used synonymously when referring to binge eating, so much so that the real meaning of the word binge has been in some ways skewed. Comparing the terms that are often associated with binge eating can help to clarify what BED is and what BED is not. Occasional overeating is not binge eating disorder. Eating an extra helping of mashed potatoes with gravy or a slice of pumpkin pie, or 2 or 3, during a Thanksgiving feast is not indicative of BED. Even if one feels guilt or regret afterwards for eating more than they wanted to, there is a coexisting factor that must be present to mark the behavior as a binge. Was there also that loss of control, like one could not possibly stop eating despite physical discomfort? Was it isolative behavior? Or was one simply immersing themselves in a special occasion, surrounded by friends and family? And most importantly, in this instance, does this behavior occur regularly, or just on occasional weekends out to eat with friends or holidays where there is an abundance of food available? There is even a difference between binge eating as a disordered behavior and BED as a disease. As a general matter, occasional indulgence or even sporadic episodes of eating a large amount of food does not signify the presence of BED. It all comes down to how frequent the behavior is and whether a loss of control is occurring. Is there significant distress around the behavior? How is the behavior impacting one's daily functioning, if at all? Again, if the binge eating episodes are distressing to the individual and disruptive to one's daily life, it is important to bring up with a medical professional. Emotional eating is not necessarily binge eating disorder. Emotional eating is defined as turning to food for comfort when facing extreme emotions, whether consciously or subconsciously. An individual's way of coping with feelings of stress, boredom, or loneliness